I am woman, hear me roar. Many of us once let our roar be heard, boisterous and loud, over a couple of shots of whiskey at our favorite bar. And many of us let the chemicals we once loved roar through our nostrils, our veins, coursing through our blood and roaring through our systems with a vengeance. We also roar now, in our recovery. Our abysmal, throaty roar begins to rise up from deep inside our souls as we fight this battle of addiction with all the gumption of an ancient female warrior. As women, we face a different challenge in recovery. Until the 1990s, most addiction research was done on men. Since then, some distinct gender differences have surfaced between men and women in regards to addiction. Men are more likely to become addicts, while women become dependent much sooner. Drugs and alcohol affect us more intensely, as we usually weigh less, and our bodies naturally have less water and more fat, which can cause drugs and alcohol to respond differently inside our feminine figures. Women also find it harder to quit, and they are more likely to relapse. Some attribute this to the fact that women are more sensitive to their environments, so triggers affect them more profoundly. Prescription pill abuse has become a huge issue in our country, and women more often find themselves in the grips of an opiate addiction. Women are more likely to be prescribed opiates, as they are more likely to suffer from a chronic pain syndrome, such as fibromyalgia. Women are also more affected by their guilt. As women, we are more emotional, more sensitive. We can be ruled by our emotions, and things like guilt and shame can really eat away at us. We often feel a higher sense of obligation to our families. The woman is traditionally the glue that holds the family together. And as women, we experience strong emotional ties with our loved ones. We are naturally caregivers, compassionate and intense. We are often ruled by our hearts rather than our heads, and that can work either for or against us. Many of us out there are also mothers. Being addicted to drugs or alcohol while being a mother can be a huge source of guilt for many women. I'm a recovering addict and a mother, although I got clean before I had my child. So I admit I cannot speak from personal experience, but I can speak from the experience of some of my dearest friends who were, or still are, mothers struggling with addiction. I think about a particular dear friend of mine who has struggled with her heroin addiction for years. She was not an addict when her first child was born, but her descent began before he was 3. She had another son later, whom she has managed to take care of in spite of her addiction. She admits, "Sometimes I'm amazed I did not have him taken away from me. I feel so lucky for that now." I remember her lamenting over the intense guilt she felt many times. I heard about it over and over again through the years of our friendship. Before her second son was born, she carried the guilt of losing custody of her first child heavily. She was supposed to be there to take him to soccer practice and drop him off at the skate park. Instead, she pawned it off on someone else so she could go score. She was supposed to be there helping him with his homework, but instead she was nodded out on the couch. And each time she came down, all the guilt came crashing down on her as well. She got pregnant a third time as well, and made the decision to give him up for adoption. She knew she could not take care of another child. She was struggling enough to take care of herself, not to mention the child she already had. And she also knew she could not stop using. The guilt tore away at her the whole time she carried that third child. And that same guilt just drove her to keep using, more and more. Not just heroin this time, but she was shooting crack through the pregnancy as well. She cried and cried when we talked about it. I did not ask if the baby was born healthy, but I do know that someone adopted that child, and my dear friend knows it was the best thing for him. Her second child has been with her through so much, and now it brings tears to my eyes to see their pictures on Facebook, riding bikes, playing by the river, laughing. They always seem to be laughing today. She has been clean for about a year and a half now. As women, we are more emotional. Yes, sometimes our emotions flow with the cycles of the moon, and men may be baffled at our emotional behavior at least once a month. We cry at sappy movies, sometimes even at the sad dog eyes staring up from a cage on the SPCA commercial. We often judge our world by the feelings in our hearts, forgetting sometimes to weigh in the logic of our brains. We may let our guilt get the best of those emotions at times, and other times our love shines stronger than we ever imagined. As women, we are passionate and dedicated. We create strong emotional bonds with other people, especially other women. In recovery, we find we are able to use those bonds to heal us. The shared experience is so vital in recovery, and women get that shared experience in a much different manner. We are intense and intensely passionate and intensely compassionate. Together, we can relate to that whole host of emotions. I think back to a women's recovery group that saved my life. I was still on probation after kicking a cop in the balls when I was so drunk I could barely stand up. I was court-ordered into outpatient treatment. I was a heroin addict who had not used in 2 years. What the hell could I get out of these stupid outpatient groups that I had not already mastered? But I still kept drinking, and I still kept getting in trouble with it. Another arrest for public drunk, and then I tested positive in my outpatient treatment for alcohol several times. I remember sitting in my probation officer's tiny little cubicle while she looked down at me over her paperwork. Her normally kind and encouraging eyes looked disappointed, almost sullen. She looked up at me and reminded me that last month, after some minor trouble, she had recommended that I go to a different outpatient treatment center. But that will just end up extending my probation even longer because I will have to start all over, I reminded her. She looked at me sharply and said, "You are obviously not getting anything out of this group now. If you have to spend the time and money anyway to satisfy the judge, then why not get something out of it?" I guess she had a point. She recommended another outpatient center. She mentioned that they had a really great women's group, and she encouraged me to join. She even gave me the times they met, just to make sure it would fit into my schedule. Somehow, she knew I would get something out of it. She gave me a card, complete with the counselor's name and number. I took a leap of faith that day. I went home, called the number, and was seen for an intake that week. I had reservations about starting over. I still had the attitude that I did not really need all of this. I was, after all, a heroin addict who had not used in 2 years. What did I need this treatment for? Of course, I carried that attitude right into the intake. I remember sitting there with a young blonde counselor opposite the desk. The room was peach and sparse and serene, and I went on with my haughty attitude of someone who thought they did not need recovery. She looked at my paperwork, she looked at me, and she turned her head a little to one side. "I understand your point," she began. "You're not out drinking every day. You don't wake up and need a drink like you once woke up and needed a shot of heroin. You no longer work in a strip club to support your habit, and you can keep a roof over your head. I realize that in comparison to a couple years ago, you are functioning rather well. I get that. But look at it like this." She paused. "You do not drink that often, but every time you do, it seems like something happens, something disastrous, something catastrophic even. If you ask me, that too is a problem." I sat there for a minute, shock absorbed by her words. I sat there, silent, pondering, and I realized she was right. So I took her recommendation, lengthened my probation, and started going to the women's group twice a week. Within the confines of that group, I knew we could say anything. The blonde counselor who did my intake ran the group, and she often let our conversation flow back and forth between stories, opinions. Ideas bounced across the room in those sessions, and the conversation meandered through all of our minds and all of our experiences. We got to know one another, and we came to love one another. Our solidarity through both the shared experience of addiction and the shared experience of being a woman was evident in each meeting. One of our members finally went to court and got sentenced to a year for her third DUI. We all wrote her letters and sent her books. A few of us even went to visit her. In that room, I knew I could say anything. There was never any fear of being judged or any reason for bravado. Women often feel the societal consequences of addiction more intensely than men do. There's something Victorian in the world's thinking, condemning the woman for using and not being at home with the laundry and the diapers. We are supposed to act like ladies, and boisterous shouting at the bar is not what ladies do. Working in a strip club is not what ladies do. Shooting dope and coke in your veins in a darkened alleyway is definitely not something ladies do. We know that we will never be accepted by societal norms when we are doing these things. And many of us do not even really want to conform to societal norms. But we do want to be accepted, and we do not like to be looked down upon. We feel the shame of that condemnation with such intensity sometimes, and that shame keeps us in the cycle of addiction, hiding all of our secrets within the depths of our soul, where we would not dare admit some of those things in our memory and our hearts. But in that room, I knew I could admit those things and finally talk about them. All the judgment had long since been passed on each and every one of us. We were finally beginning to come to terms with our guilt and our shame. And in that room, that safe room full of women, the stigma of a woman being held by the grips of addiction was finally shed. We were finally free to say anything we wanted. And we all roared. Twice a week, we roared. We laughed and we cried. And we held each other's hand in recovery. Women have a powerful connection among one another that many men cannot even begin to imagine. With the power of one another in our recovery, we finally become free. With the courage to embrace our femininity as much as we must learn to embrace ourselves, we are once again allowed to roar. And together in sobriety, that roar is deafening.